Alright, today I'm working on the rear axle of the Rover P4 and I'll take you along and show how this whole thing is put together. It's a solid axle with a removable differential, and although the design is simple, the removal process has a few extra steps that make it more involved than you would expect. So here is the diff. It bolts straight into the axle housing and the prop shaft attaches at the front. One important thing, this thing is heavy, about 27 kilograms, so you don't want it dropping on your face. And honestly, the heaviest part of the whole job is removing the diff itself. I don't have a hydraulic transmission jack, so I made a temporary DIY lifting setup using a standard screw car jack. It worked, but in the end it actually turned out easier just to lift the diff by hand. Since I was lying on the floor under the car, most of the weight went through my arms and shoulders rather than my back, so it wasn't as bad as it sounds. Now, what has to come off first? Before the diff can move at all, the brake drums need to come off. Then the brake line on each axle shaft assembly has to be disconnected. A neat trick here: press the brake pedal down and wedge it in place. I just use a length of wood that closes the master cylinder ports and keeps most of the brake fluid from draining out. Then the parking brake rods have to be unhooked. They run straight to each axle shaft assembly, so everything needs to be free. With the brakes out of the way, the axle shafts can slide out. Each assembly carries its own wheel bearing, and unfortunately, the bearing needs a special Rover tool, so replacing it isn't really a home garage job. Each side also has a single brake wheel cylinder, and then the square adjuster on the opposite side for setting the shoe clearance. Very straightforward setup. On earlier versions of the axle, you'd have a small rubber seal that sits in a recess to keep axle oil in. But on my setup, the sealing is done with wet sealant, so the flange surfaces have to be cleaned properly before it all goes back together. Once both axle shafts are out, you can finally reach all the bolts around the flange. Take the nuts off, support the diff, and then it can be pulled out of the housing. Again, 27 kilos, so don't underestimate it. When putting it back, the entire mating face needs to be sealed with wet sealant. That's what keeps the axle oil contained. So to wrap up, that's the whole process. Drums off, brake lines disconnected, parking brake rods off, axle shafts out, diff unbolted and removed, clean and reseal the flange on reassembly. The design is beautifully simple, but because of the hydraulics and the sealing, it's a bit more of a project than on some later classics. And I should say, because part of this job is done under the car, it's much nicer to tackle in the summer, with the garage doors open, bright natural light, and warm, dry air. Here in Ireland, the last thing you want to do on a dark winter evening is crawl into a cold, wet garage to wrestle with a 1950s differential. Summer makes the whole thing far more pleasant.